Why has it taken so long, one of my viewers asked earlier on, to turn to one of the most efficient arms of the state, the army, to sort out a crisis that's been kicking us in the whatsits for far too long?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one we need to grapple with. I think there is still a stigma in government that calling in the cavalry, resorting to the armed forces, is somehow an indication that you failed. And it's horrible to say this because we're all on the same side. When there is a challenge, when there is a crisis, you absolutely look to solve it from a commercial, from a civil, from a government perspective. But if you can't cope, then absolutely utilize the resources that you have. And the armed forces are our backup. They are there exactly to do what they say on the tin, to look after our interest and to step in when other departments can't manage. And whether that's a terrorist attack or flooding, or indeed from a security perspective, they are there. They're willing to do this, and they train for it as well. So why there is a delay, it is frustrating, because ultimately you actually worsen the situation in waiting until things get so bad. Now we need to call in the armed forces. And just to elaborate a bit, it's also to do with the decision making, our ability to manage crises. And I'm afraid this has come under scrutiny because of COVID and because of the evacuation of Afghanistan as well. We don't do emergencies well. The swift decision making isn't there. The situational awareness needs to be improved. The utility of the National Security Council is something that needs to be energized so we can get the right decision makers around the table to look ahead at what's coming around the corner and act today rather than leaving it for a week or so, as we did with this crisis, until we act.
Come to precisely that in just a couple of questions' time, Tobias, if I may, because I want to put back to you what Ian Martin said about it as well and what Juliet Samuel says today in the Telegraph about it. But one other thing, I know that many of the people who are listening to our conversation will want me to ask you. You're a former squaddy yourself, let alone chair of the Select Committee. Do soldiers actually mind, or perhaps even quite enjoy, or grit their teeth and follow orders when it comes to getting that call saying, this week, you're not defending the nation somewhere in some far-flung place, you're driving a tanker up the M1?
It is the decision of government to call in the armed forces, but I can tell you that they look at these crises and say, why don't you ask us? Give us the call. We're ready to go. The thing is that it's military assistance to civil effect. The army themselves can't launch themselves because that could be tantamount to a coup. You could see where life might go if the army decides to step in by their own volition. It requires the government or a government department to put their hand up and say, we can't manage. And that takes a bold and confident leader to be able to do that, to say, we don't have the strengths here. We do have them over there. Let's utilize them. Let's provide that action. And that's where I wanted to see the Prime Minister step forward in recognizing a week ago there was absolutely a chronic shortage of drivers. We now appreciate that. We have some spare capacity there. It isn't the big solution. There's no doubt about it. You've got to recruit more. But ultimately, the crisis, being told, yes, there's enough fuel in the country, tell that to the people at the pumps themselves, because it's not in the right place. And if the armed forces can get it to the right place, they are seen as a cavalry. Let's get them in there. Let's get them working.
There's basically political nerve, having the guts to do it. So, for example, your chum Grant Shapps initially said, no, we don't need visas because that looks like Brexit's failed. And then he said, yeah, well, maybe we do. And then the Prime Minister took a deep breath and also said, you know what, lorry driving owners, company owners, pay them some more money and they might come back to work. But for a week, they were caught like bunnies in the headlights.
So this is where the National Security Council comes together and recognises, yes, there is an impact on Brexit. We've chosen a different view. It's going to take away some drivers, 10 to 15%. How are we going to fill that gap? And the purpose of the National Security Council is exactly that, is to say, OK, if there are extra capabilities in this part of the country, or if there is a dearth in that part of the country, how do we fix it? And unfortunately, that difficult decision making, the questioning of what's coming over the horizon doesn't take place. We have excellent ministers, secretaries of state, but many of them work in silos. You need the National Security Council to bring heads together, knock heads together to give us a solution. And once you have a solution, communicate that to the nation, because that's the only way you're going to regain the confidence of the nation to say, yeah, they're back in control. I can see that. I don't feel the need to rush out and fill my tank of petrol up, even though I've got half a tank already.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. And final point on this before coming to the general way in which we cope with crises and forward planning and stuff like that. Also intrigued to read the appointment, or the invitation, rather, I should say, of former Vice Chief of the Defence Staff, General Messenger, by Sajid Javid, to cast his beady ex-Marine's eye over the National Health Service. Looking about efficiencies, yes, and how we get the best bang for our taxpayer buck, but also leaders. Who are the great leaders now and the leaders of the future? That's a gutsy decision by Sajid as well, is it not?
I think it is. It's very bold. It's interesting as well. Gordon Messenger, don't forget, was involved in the armed forces contribution to COVID-19. So he's no stranger to the world of health and emergencies and so forth. But he's particularly familiar with emergency planning, with responding, everything that we've just been talking about. And ultimately, making those difficult leadership decisions is exactly what you need in a crisis.
Yeah.
So I think it's actually very interesting that he's been appointed to bring his experience in, and that Sajid Javid has chosen to take advantage of that.
Yeah, absolutely intriguing. As you said, as almost a throwaway line, but crucially earlier on in the conversation, Tobias, we take as read that there's no suggestion of the military taking over like some banana republic or Tim Pock dictatorship. We are sufficiently a mature and confident democracy that these things can happen and our liberty is safe.
It's such an important point to make, I think, because it illustrates the professionalism of our armed forces, of how they act in conditions, and the fact that they're the masters, the government is who they respond to. They will only act if they are given the instructions, if they're given the green light. But I would use this opportunity, if I may, to say that we need to look at our complex way of life. Our fragile, just-in-time supply chain is so easily broken, or can be impacted by problems, as we've seen with the fuel crisis. If your armed forces are your backup, then we need enough of them. They need to be trained in the right way. They need to have the transporters, in the case of fuel, to be able to step in. And what we've done is cut our armed forces by 10,000. Our army, has been depleted in that sense. Our armed forces vehicles have been, reduced as well. So let's look back at that now. As our world gets more complicated, as we have to lean on them more and more, as we're doing, let's make sure that that backup has all the assets, the skill sets, and the strengths that it needs to be there when we request them.
As I said to you earlier, and you will know, that Ian Martin in the Times, I think it was on Wednesday, and Juliet Samuel in the Telegraph today, are both saying we need a plan. Tories don't tend to like plans. They like to be less interventionist, than they like to be more deal with it in the here and now. But both Ian and Juliet say, last minute, as you just said yourself, doesn't work anymore, and as night follows day, there will be another shortage crisis. It's not sexy politics, Tobias, but it is vital to how we function as a society. Who is up to doing that? Is Boris really up to that?
Well, let's just divide those two and just emphasize the importance of good decision-making, of situational awareness, of making sure the right people are around the table to look what's coming over the horizon. Now, that was absolutely required under COVID-19. Indeed, I think the nation wanted to be given instructions. This was an unknown threat. We were learning all the time what to do. We want clarity. We want to know somebody's in control. And suddenly we have this other crisis to do with the fuel. Again, there's now almost an expectation that you look to see a national address from the Prime Minister clarifying and keeping in check the scale of this crisis. Now, this crisis could have been mitigated, in my view, had there been better communications, because as has been repeated again and again by the government, there's plenty of fuel. We just have to be patient about making sure of when we actually fill up. Everybody charges to the pumps and we run out. So therefore, utility of the message, showing your commands, showing you're in control, keeping the confidence of the nation, the consent of the nation is all the more critical, as I say, as our world gets more and more complicated.
It seems to me also domestically that what is now emerging, and Keir Starmer at his conference last week touched thoughtfully upon this, the relationship between his party and wealth creation, industry, business and what have you. There is emerging now a profound clash between letting markets solve matters, whether it's fuel or NHS or whatever it might be, and costly government interventions. We are moving to an era where it's make your mind up time, and that's going to define your party.
I mean, you touched on something that's very profound there, because at the heart of what conservatism is about is, yes, allowing the market forces, to use their solutions to be able to progress, advance, to compete, to allow us to move forward. But when it comes to emergencies, then it is the government that I think countries actually will look to. And therefore, the qualifications they have to make those decisions and the machinery of government are absolutely critical. The National Security Council that I've mentioned a couple of times, that was actually pushed aside in COVID. They came up with a new construct completely. And that isn't the right way to go about. You need to have a machinery of government that brings together the experts, that brings together the necessary decision makers, so the nation can actually see that's happening, and then you're able to then communicate to the nation as to where you actually want to go. And I'm afraid at the moment, the way our government operates, it's too siloed, it's too risk averse, it's not swift enough to deal with the scale of challenges that are being presented to the country and to the British people.
I didn't interrupt. Strong line there, and I find that fascinating. Final point to you, Tobias. My assertion is that we're also moving into an era where businesses need to be weaned off state aid and consumers need to relearn how to stand on their own 2 feet. A quick thought from Tobias Ellwood?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big question. It came up with sort of tax credits and so forth.
Yeah.
The Chancellor has done an incredible job, I think, in supporting us during this COVID-19. But this can't go on forever. We need to be able to get back on our feet and to start, making sure that the economy operates. I think the big change that I would encourage perhaps government to think about, the last time our nation was tested in this way was in the Second World War. We then came up with a war debt, which actually wasn't paid off until Gordon Brown's time as being Prime Minister. It was paid off, over a 50-year period. My concern is that we've got this £400 billion debt, and we're trying to balance the books in a very short period of time. That's affecting the health budget. That's affecting education. That's affecting defence and so forth. And I just think that Rishi Sunak, given the clever fiscal, machinery that he came up with to support us during COVID, could come up with some other instrument to allow us to pay this back over a longer period of time, so we're not suffering. This generation doesn't suffer, and even more so the next.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.